In the spring of 2014, on a Tuesday morning when the air still held the cool that passes through South Louisiana before the heat takes over for good, three sisters walked out the back door of their family homestead in Terrebonne Parish and were never seen again. No bodies, no car, no note, and for 12 years, not a single piece of physical evidence that told investigators anything with certainty. Then, 8 weeks ago, a man running a drainage survey near a stretch of cypress-choked water called Cutter's Slough pulled something out of silt with a long hook. It was a leather satchel, sealed with a brass clasp, and inside it was a journal written in 3 different hands. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The Moreau Homestead, and that is the name we'll use throughout this story, though the real family has asked for their privacy, sat on about 4 acres of elevated ground off a gravel road that locals have been calling by the same name for 80 years. The house itself was nothing remarkable. Board and batten siding painted the color of old cream, a screen porch that ran the full length of the south-facing wall, a stand of water oaks that shed their leaves in February and leaf back out by March. The kind of place that had been in a family long enough that it no longer felt like property. It felt like the family itself. The land and the people had become the same thing over generations, and everyone in the surrounding community understood that distinction. You didn't just know the Moreau family. You knew where they came from. The 3 sisters, we'll call them Celeste, Nadine, and Ray, were 34, 31, and 27 years old at the time of their disappearance. Celeste was the oldest, a licensed practical nurse who drove 40 minutes each way to a clinic in Houma 3 days a week. Nadine had taken over the management of the property after their father's passing in 2011, handling the small agricultural lease they had on the back acreage. Ray, the youngest, had returned home roughly 18 months before the disappearance after a brief period living in Baton Rouge. Neighbors describe her return as quiet and uncomplicated. She came back. She helped around the house. She seemed fine. No one thought much of it. Their mother, Odette Moreau, had been placed in a memory care facility in Thibodaux about 2 years before the disappearance. She was alive then and remained alive for several years afterward, though she was never able to contribute meaningfully to any investigation. What she said on the occasions when investigators visited her was consistent but vague. She spoke of her daughters the way someone speaks of people they expect to see at Christmas. Present tense. No alarm, no grief, just waiting. What made the Moreau sisters' disappearance so difficult to categorize from the beginning was a complete absence of distress signals in the days leading up to it. Celeste had worked her shift on that Monday, the day before they vanished. She had spoken to a colleague about a patient's discharge plan scheduled for Thursday. She had picked up a prescription from a pharmacy in town. Nadine had called the feed supply company that Monday afternoon to check on a delivery that was running late. The man she spoke to remembered the conversation because she had been patient with him about it, not agitated, not in a hurry. She said she'd call back at the end of the week. Ray had been seen at the post office. She mailed 2 letters. No one has ever identified who those letters were addressed to. The following morning, a neighbor who shared property line with the Moreaus noticed that the truck, a faded green pickup that Celeste drove to work, was still in the yard at a time when it was usually gone. He noted it, didn't think much of it. Later that same day, he noticed the screen porch door was swinging in the wind, which was unusual. Odette had been particular about that door her entire life, and the habit had passed to her daughters. By evening, when the truck still hadn't moved and the lights in the house hadn't come on, he walked over and knocked. No answer. He went home, ate supper, and told his wife it was probably nothing. It was his wife who called the sheriff's office. The first deputies on scene found the house unlocked. Inside, there were signs of an interrupted morning. Coffee had been made. 2 cups had been used. A third was clean in the drying rack. Celeste's nursing bag was on the kitchen table. The back door was unlocked, and the latch on the screen was unhooked. Out back, near the tree line where the property sloped down toward a drainage ditch that fed eventually into Cutter's Slough, investigators found footprints in the soft mud. 3 sets, moving in the same direction, away from a house. The footprints reached the ditch's edge and did not continue on the other side. The initial theory developed quickly, and it was not unreasonable. The Bayou terrain in that part of Terrebonne Parish is legitimately dangerous. Water levels shift. Ground that looks solid gives way. There have been cases before, not many, but some, of people losing their footing near the slough and being pulled under by current or trapped by root systems beneath the surface. The working assumption for the first several weeks was accidental drowning. All three sisters, for some reason not yet understood, had walked to the water's edge together and something had gone wrong. Search and rescue teams covered the slough and its tributary channels for 11 days. Divers went in. Sonar equipment was brought down from the state level. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing. Nothing that could be linked to the Moreau sisters. At this point, investigators were left with two possibilities. Which one would you have believed? The absence of remains in a body of water is not, on its own, proof that a drowning didn't occur. Bayou environments are complex and unpredictable, and it was not impossible that three bodies could have traveled downstream and dispersed in ways that made recovery unlikely. The investigators held to this explanation, but quietly, the emphasis shifted. If there were no bodies to find, the case became less about recovery and more about explanation. And explanation required looking harder at what had been happening in the Moreau household in the weeks before that Tuesday morning. What emerged from that deeper look was not dramatic. It was subtle, and it took time to see. A former colleague of Celeste mentioned, when interviewed a month after the disappearance, that Celeste had seemed distracted in the weeks leading up to it. Not worried, exactly. Preoccupied. The colleague had assumed it was related to their mother's declining health and hadn't asked. A man who did occasional mechanic work on Nadine's equipment said she had asked him about 3 weeks before the disappearance whether he knew anything about property liens, whether a lien could be placed on land without the owner's knowledge. He hadn't known much about it, and they hadn't discussed it further. He mentioned it almost as an afterthought, and the investigators noted it without following up. That would turn out to be the first of several missed threads. Ray's situation was harder to read because she had fewer regular contacts. She hadn't reestablished a social life after returning from Baton Rouge. She spent most of her time at the house or on the property. But one detail surfaced when investigators spoke to Odette's care facility staff. Ray had visited her mother twice in a week before the disappearance, which was unusual. Normally, the sisters visited on Sundays, rotating one at a time. Ray's 2 visits that week were on a Wednesday and a Friday, unannounced. And on the second visit, staff recalled that she had sat with her mother for almost 3 hours and had cried when she left. When asked why, Ray had said simply that she missed her. That detail was recorded in the case file and went nowhere for years. 18 months into the investigation, the Sheriff's Department formally reclassified the case as a missing persons investigation rather than a presumed drowning. The change in classification was procedural, but it carried a different weight in the community. Presumed drown meant tragedy. Missing persons meant something else. It meant someone might know something. It meant the question of where the Moreau sisters had gone was still open in a way that implicated people, not just water and weather. The problem was that the investigation had, by then, already begun to slow. The detective originally assigned to the case had retired. His replacement was working 4 other active cases. The interviews that had been scheduled for a second round never happened. The question of the property lien, the one Nadine had raised with the mechanic, was never formally pursued. There are records that show a title search was requested on the Moreau property in early 2015, about 9 months after the disappearance, but there is no record of what that search returned. The document that would have contained those results is listed in the evidence log, but was not in the physical file when the case was reviewed by a state-level cold case unit in 2019. The investigator who reviewed it noted the gap and marked it for follow-up. There is no record that the follow-up occurred. This is the kind of thing that, in isolation, can be explained by bureaucratic failure. Files get misfiled. Documents get scanned incorrectly or stored in the wrong location. Institutional systems, particularly in under-resourced rural departments, are imperfect. But the missing title search was not the only gap. There was also the matter of Ray's letters. When the post office visit was first established, confirmed by a postal worker who recognized Ray by description and remembered her because she paid for her stamps with exact change, Investigators requested any tracking or forwarding records associated with letters mailed that day. They were told that since the letters were standard mail, not certified, there would be no tracking. The postal worker remembered Ray clearly, but could not remember the addresses on the envelopes. He thought one of them might have been going out of state, but he wasn't certain. That was as far as that line of inquiry got. In 2019, a reporter working on a retrospective piece about cold cases in the parish submitted a public records request for Morrow investigative file. The department complied, but several pages had been redacted. When the reporter pushed back on the redactions, citing specific exemptions that should not have applied to a missing persons case, she received a response citing ongoing investigative sensitivity. She wrote about the redactions in her piece. The piece ran, generated some local interest, and then receded. The family, which at that point consisted primarily of an elderly aunt and a handful of more distant relatives, did not have the resources to pursue the matter legally. The case remained cold for another 3 years. And then, this past January, something changed. The drainage survey that found the journal was a routine operation conducted by a private contractor working on behalf of the parish. The crew was mapping sediment buildup in the channels feeding into Cutter's Slough as part of a long-term flood mitigation project. The man who retrieved the satchel described it as having been lodged between the root system of a fallen cypress and the channel wall, buried under approximately 14 inches of silt and organic matter. He said the leather was dark and compressed but intact. The brass clasp had oxidized but held. The journal inside was in a condition that no one initially believed possible. The pages were discolored, some fragile at the edges, but the ink was legible across the majority of the entries. A forensic document examiner brought in by the state police noted that the satchel had been sealed with a heavy waxcloth liner that was not visible from the outside. It had been placed inside the satchel before sealing, essentially creating a secondary moisture barrier. This was not accidental. Someone had deliberately prepared the journal for long-term storage in a wet environment. Someone had packed it to be found later, or at least to survive. The journal itself was a standard composition-style book, the kind sold at any pharmacy or hardware store, with a black cloth cover. Inside the front cover, written in a hand the document examiner would later identify as belonging to Celeste, was a single sentence. "If you are reading this, we knew you would eventually." What followed was 68 pages of handwritten entries spanning approximately 14 days before the date of the disappearance. The entries were not written sequentially by a single author. They were written in rotation, sometimes on the same day, sometimes days apart, in 3 distinct hands that investigators matched, through comparison with documents recovered from the homestead, to Celeste, Nadine, and Ray. The journal was shared. All 3 of them had written in it, passed it between themselves, and apparently left it where they believed it had the best chance of being found. The early entries are domestic and measured. Celeste writes about a patient she is concerned about, a scheduling conflict at the clinic, a meal she made that turned out better than expected. Nadine writes about the back acreage, about the lease, about a problem with a fence that needed mending. Ray writes about her mother, about a dream she had, about a song she heard on the radio that she couldn't get out of her head. Reading those first dozen pages, you would not know anything was wrong. You would think you were reading the private record of 3 women living an ordinary life in an ordinary house, writing to each other in the kind of shorthand that only develops between people who have shared every room and every year. Then, on what is labeled in the journal as the 8th day of entries, Nadine's handwriting changes. Not dramatically, but the letters compress slightly. The pressure on the pen increases. She writes, "He came to property line again today. Didn't come closer. Just stood there by the road and looked. I didn't go out. I didn't want him to know I'd seen him." She does not identify who he is. Not in that entry, and not in any entry that follows. He is referred to throughout the remaining pages only as he, him, or the man from the road. What becomes clear through the subsequent entries is that all 3 sisters were aware of him, that his presence near the property had begun some weeks before the journal started, and that they had, for reasons they partially explain, chosen not to report to anyone outside the household. The reasons they give are cautious and circuitous. Celeste writes that they had tried, once, to raise a concern with someone in an official capacity, and that the conversation had not gone the way they hoped. She does not specify what was said or to whom they spoke. Nadine writes that the situation with the property had to be resolved first, that until they understood what they were dealing with on the title, anything else they said would be turned around on them. Ray writes the most plainly of the three. We know what he wants. We know what he's been trying to take. The question is whether we can prove it before he decides to stop waiting. What the man wanted, as best as can be pieced together from the journal's content, relates to the Moreau property itself. There are references to a document, to signatures, to a transaction that the sisters believe had been forged or coerced. Nadine's entries are the most specific on this point. She writes about a meeting she attended at the courthouse, about a clerk who told her something she wasn't supposed to hear, about a name she found in records that she had not expected to find. She does not write the name down. At one point she writes, I'm not putting his name in here in case someone finds this who shouldn't, which suggests she knew there was a possibility the journal might reach the wrong hands. Toward the end of the journal, the entries shift again. The tone in all three voices becomes less analytical and more urgent, not panicked. None of the three women write in a way that suggests they have lost their composure, but the sentences get shorter. The observations become pointed. On what appears to be 2 days before the disappearance, Celeste writes, We've made a decision. We are not telling anyone here. We are going somewhere where we can be heard. She does not write where. The final entry in the journal is in Ray's hand. It is brief. It reads, We are leaving the journal here because we want there to be a record that isn't in the house. Whatever happens next, we were not confused about what was happening. We understood it clearly. We made a choice. We want someone to know that. The last line of the journal, the last sentence Ray Moreau ever committed to paper, is this: The house will still be here when we get back. Whether that is a statement of hope or something else is a question that everyone who has read that line has answered differently, and no two people seem to agree. The forensic authentication of the journal was completed 6 weeks ago. The paper, the ink, the wax liner, the leather of the satchel, all of it has been dated to the years immediately preceding or surrounding 2014. There is no credible evidence of fabrication. The handwriting has been matched to writing samples from the homestead with a high degree of confidence. The journal is real. The three sisters wrote it. They buried it or placed it near the water before they left. What the journal does not do is solve anything. It names no one. It identifies no crime in explicit terms. It establishes compellingly that three women believed they were in danger from a specific person connected to their property, and that they had tried to seek help from official channels and felt their efforts had been dismissed or deflected. It establishes that they left voluntarily and with a purpose, but it does not tell us where they went, what happened after they left, or whether they are still alive. The property lien question, the one Nadine raised with mechanic years before any of this was known, has now been pulled back into focus. A title researcher working with a legal advocacy organization has been examining the chain of title on the Moreau property. She has said publicly that she found inconsistencies in filings from the period between 2012 and 2014, which would place those filings during the years after the father's death and before the sisters disappeared. She has declined to say more until she is confident in her findings. The legal advocacy organization has said the matter is under active review. The name that Nadine found in the records, the name she chose not to write down, remains unknown. It is a central unanswered question of everything the journal contains, and it may be the thing that, if ever identified, changes the shape of this case entirely. The redacted pages in the 2019 public records request have not been released. A renewed request was submitted following the journal's authentication. The response cited the same exemption as before: ongoing investigative sensitivity. The case has not been formally upgraded to a homicide investigation. It has not been formally closed. It exists in the space between, which is perhaps the most honest description of where it has always existed. Celeste, Nadine, and Ray Moreau would be, today, 46, 43, and 39 years old. There's a version of the story in which they walked out of that parish in 2014 with a purpose, found their way somewhere safe, and have been living quietly ever since, aware that their name occasionally reappears in the news. There's a version in which something happened to them after they left the property and before they reached wherever they intended to go. There is a version in which someone knew where they were going and was waiting. The journal does not eliminate any of these possibilities. It only confirms that the women themselves did not believe they were walking into a situation they didn't understand. They understood it very well. The sentence that stays with you when you sit long enough with this case is not the last one. It's not the line about the house still being there when they get back. It's the one Celeste wrote on the inside front cover, the first thing anyone reading the journal would see. If you are reading this, we knew you would eventually. That sentence was written by a woman who expected to be gone long enough for the journal to matter, who counted on time passing, who trusted that eventually someone would come to the water with the right equipment and the right questions, and that the things she had packed carefully and left in the silt would still be intact when they did. She wasn't wrong about that. It was there. The question that remains is whether the rest of what she believed, that being found would mean something, that the record would lead somewhere, that the name Nadine refused to write down would eventually be spoken aloud by someone with the authority to act on it. Whether any of that turns out to be true, that question does not have an answer yet. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If something in this story connects to something you know about the property records, about the region, about anyone who has spoken about this case over the years, say so in the comments, not as speculation, not as accusation, just as information. Sometimes a detail that breaks a case open is the one that seems too small to mention. The Morrow sisters thought it mattered enough to write it down. The least we can do is keep asking.